We're good there, Brother Billy. Again, you guys keep those that we put on our prayer list in prayer. We added a few more people this morning, and as you well know, that prayer works. I know a lot of people that have come up to me in the past, and I had this guy that called me last night. He's place where I used to work, and he's always thanking me for certain things, and I'm like, hey, you had just as much a part of it than I did. I said, because I prayed for you guys and you guys prayed for me. He goes, absolutely. And so prayer works. And I told him, I said, Edward, with the things going on in that plant, you have to be prayed up. And you have to let God know your heart, and He'll take care of it. And so these that we added on our prayer list this morning, again, just like Brother Ralph mentioned in his prayer, God knows who they are, and He knows what they're going through, and He can fix it. He can make the change.
And don't forget the needs of our church.
Absolutely.
We need more young people, and young people to bring kids in, and Ralph needs a piano player.
You heard any more?
No, I said I haven't heard anything. I was hoping you might come out and say something, but nothing today.
I presented the proposal to the other church. He said he would present it to them today and get back with me on what route they wanted to go. And then I'll ask if they have anybody with English musical skills.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, this morning we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 18. Last week we covered 17, and this week we are on 18, where Absalom defeats and death. So we're talking here about David. Is up in his years as well, and but things are going on, and Absalom's trying to take over, and we've just been seeing all this stuff play out before us in the previous chapters, and we're coming to an end here pretty soon, and you guys it'll come to fruition, and you'll see it, the big picture here shortly. Within the next 4 or 5 chapters, and when we get into 1 Kings there, you'll be like, wow, So anyway, we're going to start there at 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 1. It says, "And David numbered the people who were with him, and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. And then David sent out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab, 1/3 under the hand of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I also will surely go out with you myself. But the people answered, You shall not go out. For if we flee away, they will not care about us, nor if half of us die, will they care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us, for you are now more help to us in the city. The king said to them, Whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. Now the king had commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains orders concerning Absalom. Excuse me. So the people went out into the field of the battle against Israel, and the battle was in the woods of Ephraim. The people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David, and a great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day. For the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. Then Absalom met the servants of David. Absalom rode on a mule. The mule went under the thick bough of a great terebinth tree, and his head caught in the terebinth. So he was left hanging between the heaven and the earth, and the mule which was under him went on. Now a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, I just saw Absalom hanging in the terebinth tree. So Joab said to the man who told him, you just saw him, and why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, beware lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise I would have dealt falsely against my own life, for there is nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against me. Then Joab said, I cannot linger with you. And he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart, and while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. And 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. So Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab held back the people. And they took Absalom and cast him into a large pit in the woods, and laid a very large heap of stones over him. And then all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. I'm going to stop right there. Wow. Not what the king had in mind for his captains to do, was it? So we see that at the very beginning, we see that David numbered his people who were with him, and he set captains over all of them, right? It says, so David knew just what to do in organizing his army. He set them into 3 divisions under the leadership of Joab, Abishai, and Ittai the Gittite. So here you have 3 leaders, 3 battalion leaders, or 3 divisions rather. So these guys are very experienced in battle. They knew how to set up in wartime. They knew that they were going to be fighting in some dense forest. They knew that, as we see here down in chapter 18, verse 6, more or less 8. Verse 8 there, it says, for the battle there were scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. So that was some pretty treacherous countryside that they were fighting in, wasn't it? But David knew that the commander belonged out in the battle, so he was telling his people, I'll be out there with you. He's trying to give them a pep talk right when they started, and they told him what? No. Because you're worth more to us here, as Marines would say, in the rear with the gear, than on the front line. Why? Why do you think that? Anybody tell me?
They didn't want him killed for one thing.
Right?
That's correct.
His age had begun to show.
Over the kingship.
Absolutely, Luis. If he was to fall in battle, it was a guarantee that Absalom would be, definitely the king. So you see that it says David finally gave in to him. He said, whatever seems best to you guys, right? It says David was not stubborn. He knew how to submit to the good advice of others. He did not give up his leadership. He practiced good leadership by listening to the wise advice of the people around him. And that's how you know a good leader. I used to, tell, I've asked Roger a couple of times, him being in the service as long as I had, hey, did you, how was your officers in the Army? Because in the Marine Corps, a lot of times you'll get these young men that come out of college and they want to do good and they want to go up through the ranks and they want to be able to lead right away. And they just don't have the experience. They don't have the wisdom. They don't have, the action that it takes right off the bat. They may have the mindset and the want to, and even be book smart enough, but they just don't have that that experience, the real world experience.
Yeah, that's right.
And so you can tell a good young leader who's going to be a real wise leader by the way they act and the way they listen to the leadership around them. A lot of times a young lieutenant coming out of school will get with their first sergeant or their gunnery sergeants or even their squad leaders, as far as down to their squad leaders, and ask them, how long have you been in? What have you been in any conflicts? What was it like? These types of things. How was the morale of the men around you? What kind of things did you do to overcome this type of situation? And they gather this information in order to make themselves a better leader. But David, over the years, had learned, all this stuff by listening to good leadership. And he knew, again, here, that, it was wise of them to tell him that, But we know that David also did one thing else prior to all this too, right? What was that? He inquired of who? The Lord. He inquired of the Lord.
That's the most last one.
But it says David commanded the 3 captains to do what with Absalom?
Not to hurt him.
Not to hurt him, not to kill him. It says be gentle with him. And why do you think? Why do you think of this?
It goes back to another story. Back to the not to strike the Lord's anointed. Back to another story we know, which is Saul, where he was in the cave. Not to strike, or the stories like that. Different times, multiple times David had, but also his people had the ability to take out Saul. But dare not strike the Lord's anointed.
Right. Well, also we know here that David is given the command for him to not be treated wrongly or bad, but David in his heart feels like almost like Absalom's like a young rebel, and he could probably be changed if he's a young man. He's going to make mistakes, and David knows because he had made mistakes along the way. And I'll tell you one thing that really that I use once in a while, and I tell my friends all the time that are younger than me, I'm like, just because your dad, the advice your dad gave you right now doesn't seem like it's the right thing to do or whatever, you'll find out later on in life that your dad is a lot smarter than what you give him credit for.
Because at the end of the day, David is still Absalom's dad.
Absolutely. Because that's where I was going with it, Jackie, and I appreciate that. And point out that fact that at the end of the day, Absalom was still, David's son, and he still loves his son. Even though all the things that Absalom has done, he still loves his son. And he couldn't change that fact. But he did inquire of the people, and he did listen to the people and everything. And so David stays back in the rear. And we see that the battle lasted quite a while, and also that there was, 20,000 people that lost their lives that day. And that's a lot. That's a whole lot of folks.
Especially fighting with sword and spear.
Absolutely. Hand-to-hand combat.
That's a lot now, let alone way back then.
Amen.
It is.
But we see that the woods devoured more people than the sword did. It says the phrase implies that God fought for David in unusual ways. Soldiers' loyalty to Absalom seemed to be swallowed up by the woods. So we know, and here it says, amazingly, because of the density of the trees and the rugged nature of the terrain, the pursuit through the forest resulted in more deaths than the actual combat itself. And I'm going to tell you right now, my body's broken down in several spots and places due to where I've been. And I have been in some pretty rugged, jagged, nasty places. Up in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the sands of Iraq. And I'm sure that in that dense forest was a lot of different types of reptiles. I mean, we had all kinds of vipers and stuff like that out in Iraq.
You have one in your tent.
I did have one in my tent that I killed, so.
You didn't share it.
I didn't share it. I was not sharing my tent with the salt scale viper, not having it. But,
Wanted to stay warm.
yeah, right. But we see here that Joab disobeys David. And why do you think Joab disobeyed David? Does anybody have any, what's your mindset on this? What are you thinking about?
One,
He
it
never
is,
wanted Absalom in charge.
All right. And what else?
it's in the first time he's disobeyed David.
No, it's not.
So, you know, he saw an enemy and enemies to be killed, and
He did.
he did it.
And what I'm trying to get another answer here, and maybe I probably need to read a little bit further in. So I'm just going to continue reading, and then I know that answer will probably come out in another question. So, going to continue right there at 18, chapter 18, verse 18. It says, "Now Absalom, in his lifetime, had taken and set up a pillar for himself, which is the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and to this day it is called Absalom's monument." So then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me run now and take the news to the king, how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies." And Joab said to him, "You shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to the Cushite, "Go tell the king what you have seen." So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. And Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, "But whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite." So Joab said, "Why will you run, my son, since you have no news ready?" "But whatever happens," he said, "let me run." So he said to him, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. Now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof over the gate to the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. And then the watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, "If he is alone, there is news in his mouth." And he came rapidly and drew near. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, "There is another man running alone." And the king said, "He also brings news." So the watchman said, "I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." And so Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, "All is well." Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." The king said, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant and me, your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. Just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged this day all those who rose up against you." And the king said to the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" So the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you do harm be like that young man." Then the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Wow. So, did that turn out the way you thought it was going to turn out? Yeah. So I wanted to just backtrack a little bit to the part where Joab kills Absalom. So you see that, that Absalom was riding a mule, as we read there, that he was riding a mule through. And did I pick up in the right spot? I think I did, didn't I? Yes? Okay.
Close enough.
All right. But we see that Absalom was riding the mule and that he got caught. It says the mule went underneath the thick boughs of a great terebinth tree and his head got caught in the terebinth. So it left him hanging there between the heaven and the earth. So what do you think happened here? So you got this real dense, thick forest, right? And we know that Absalom had talked about Absalom's hair, right? About every year he would cut so much, 5 pounds of hair off of his head. And so he had a lot of hair and everything, right? So here they're thinking that maybe either his neck and head got caught between the forks of the big oak, or maybe his hair might have got tangled up into the branches of the oak and everything, and there he was just left hanging. And couldn't defend himself because he was hanging there from the tree. So we see that Joab took advantage of this situation, didn't he? And killed Absalom with 3 spears. And then 10 of his armor bearers did what? They made sure that Absalom was finished off, right? So it says, Absalom rode a mule. It said Absalom's vanity put him in this battle against the wise counsel of Ahithophel, and Absalom didn't seem like a great general riding a mule into a battle. It says his head got caught in the terebinth tree, so he left him hanging between the heaven and the earth. It says Absalom was noted for his good looks and his luxurious hair. It says what was his glory was now his curse. Absalom was literally caught by his own hair in the thick trees of the forest. It says, Adam Clark is careful to point out that the text does not say that Absalom was caught by his hair, as we see here. Also, it does mention this in my Bible, that it was either a fork in the tree or the branches, but it's leaning more towards the latter part of the hair due to the fact that, like it says here, that he was adorned for his beautiful hair and the thickness and stuff like that. So more than likely, that's probably what happened. I know that as a Marine, when we were trying to get through some of the razor wire and stuff, it didn't matter where you moved. If you had some kind of cloth or anything, that razor wire will grab you, and you are stuck. You're not going anywhere. And so, same way with Absalom and his hair. He got into these thick branches and stuff like that. I don't know if any of you guys are hunters or have played out in the woods when you were younger, and you go into a thicket to make you a little fort, and you got on those clothes, kind of loose clothing or whatever, and it will grab you and you can't go. So,
pride may have got him.
as well, absolutely.
Because of all that hair, he didn't.
Absolutely. We know that, like I said, the 3 spears, Joab didn't hesitate to strike Absalom. Though he knew David commanded him not to, Joab was convinced that it was in David's best interest and Israel's best interest to show Absalom justice and not mercy. What's that?
Job's best interest.
Yeah, and his. Absolutely, and his as well. It says Absalom only received what he deserved. He was a murderer, a traitor, and a rapist. And Joab knew that David was generally indulgent towards his children and would never punish Absalom. He had seen David's actions towards his sons characterized by lack of discipline. In the highest interest of the kingdom, his hand was raised to slay Absalom. And also, like Brother Rick said, in his own interest as well, as we will see shortly.
Well, they could have cut him down just as easy as stabbing him.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And a
But
baby
would the
king.
war have ever been truly over?
Yeah. Because we see that once Joab did this to Absalom, he had them blow the horns, and all Israel fled.
The war was over.
The war was over. Absolutely. They had done what they had set out to do and accomplish what their mission was, and so they blew the horns and the war was over. It says here also that David hears of Absalom's death, the two runners. Ahimaaz wanted to take David the news of Israel's victory and Absalom's death, but Joab wanted to spare Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, the burden of being the messenger of bad news. So he sent the Cushite, right? And then the Ahimaaz was faster than the other runners. Since the messenger was someone David knew, Ahimaaz, he assumed it was good news. As we know that David mentions in the Bible here that Ahimaaz was a good man. Once he hears
But he didn't tell him.
he didn't tell him.
He just told them they'd won.
He just told him that they had won, and then when the second messenger, the Cushite, came up, David had Ahimaaz stand to the side so that he could hear what the other messenger had to say. But we see here that Ahimaaz says that he saw a great tumult, but I didn't know what it was about. So, compared to the Cushite, Ahimaaz was a better runner but a worse messenger because he didn't know his message. A message can be delivered beautifully, but the messenger's first responsibility is to get the message correct. And we notice that Joab sent him saying that what? He didn't have a message to give the king. So when he got there, he really didn't know what to say. But the Cushite knew all.
Well, he may have been pretty smart because he gave the good news that the war was over,
Right.
and left the bad news to the other messenger.
Right. He might have been a little smarter than
You give him credit for.
Right. But we see that the Cushite says he didn't actually say that Absalom was killed. He just said that what? May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. So that implied that Absalom was dead. So
But neither one of them told him that was Joab that killed him.
no, and neither one of them, that's exactly right, told him that Joab was the one who murdered him. So the king was deeply moved, and he said, "Oh my son Absalom." I'm trying to close it up here. It says David mourned so much for Absalom because he really was his son. David saw his sins, his weaknesses, his rebellion exaggerated in Absalom. And in so much as David said, what? If only I had died in your place. So that shows his love and his compassion towards his son, even though he had done all those things. Go ahead, Brother Reed.
Had he spent more time with Absalom and in his raising, there may have never been a problem at all.
He's been a better example.
Absolutely. And we also see here that, like it says, David wanted to die in the place of his rebellious son. What David could not do, God did by dying in the place of rebellious sinners like us.
Amen.
So, you guys have any questions or anything for me at this time? If not, we'll close up. We're running a little shy of getting into Brother Ralph's time. So, nobody else, then Brother Terry, close us in a word of prayer, sir.
Dear our Father, Lord, thank you for this church, Lord, and
Yes,
thank you for the lesson that we just received, Lord, and also, Lord, thank you for sending your Son to die for our sins, Lord. And Lord, please bless everyone here, and please bless the song service and the sermon we're about to receive.
Yes.
Pray.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen.